Members of Council, ladies and gentlemen, the clerk advises me that it is now 7 o'clock, so I will call this Council meeting to order. And I would ask you to please stand and join with me in a moment of silent reflection and our national anthem, O Canada. Thank you. Are there any disclosure of conflict of interest by any member of council this evening? Councillor Best?
Yes, on item number 2 of the consent item, as my wife owns property in the vicinity of the Shore Community Centre.
Thank you. Any further disclosures? Being none, we will proceed. Have a motion moved by Councillor Ali and second by Councillor Hamid, and be it resolved that consent items numbers 1 and 2 be approved. And I'm going to pull out number 2 because Councillor Best has the disclosure on that, so it'll be just on number 1. Is there anything on number 1 that any member of council wishes to pull out? If not, those in favour of number 1, and that's carried. This is the one that Councillor Best has the disclosure on. Item number 2, is there any discussion on item number 2? If not, Councillor Hamid?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just really quickly, I don't represent the area anymore, but I still want to thank staff for all the work because I occasionally hear from residents who are very excited about it. Just a quick question. When do we expect the solar panel installation investigation to finish?
Scott?
Through your worship, I'm going to ask Doug Sampano to come up to answer any questions related to construction.
Thank you. Doug, I'm not sure if you heard the question or not. Yes. Yeah.
Good evening. Through you, your worship, the solar panel installation or the investigation for the solar panel installation will begin as soon as the general contractor has finished his work and is off-site. So we'll start doing some preliminary work with Milton Hydro probably in the course of about the next month. And our goal, if everything goes according to plan, we'd like to get this wrapped up by the end of the year.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments on item number 2? If not, those in favour of that motion, and that's carried. Okay, just before I hand the chair over to acting Mayor Councillor Ali, who's going to be going into committee of the whole in just a short while, I just want to thank those individuals that attended the AMO conference just about a week ago. There, at least in my opinion, it was a good conference, and of course I know Councillor Best, who's on the board of AMO. Want to thank him very much for a lot of the work that he did on a lot of the stuff, and every one of the provincial ministers was there, and of course some of us interacted with a number of them over that 3-4 day conference there. So just wanted to share with my colleagues that it was, at least in my opinion, certainly worthwhile being there in attendance once again. Should have made mention right at the outset that we have heard from Councillor Di Lorenzo, and he will be absent this evening because he's away on work-related issues, so he'll not be present here this evening. So with that, Madam Clerk, have we forgotten anything in Council?
No, Your Worship.
I thank you very much. Members of Council, ladies and gentlemen, this portion of the Council meeting is now over. If you give us 2 minutes, and Councillor Ali will be assuming the chair to take care of the next portion of the agenda. Councillor Ali, this meeting is now adjourned.
All right, let's move on. We are moving on to presentations and delegations. First item is Staff Report ES 01519, and the subject is Service Delivery Review, Phase 1 Final Report. And I have resolution moved by Councillor Hamid and seconded by Councillor Challenor. Be it resolved that the 18 priority opportunities identified by Blackline Consulting BLC in the Service Delivery Review Phase 1 be endorsed in principle and further validated through financial and operational analysis prior to implementation. That staff be directed to provide updates to Council with respect to the progress of the priority opportunities. And I believe we have presentations, and first, Christine, Scott will come up and speak.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to welcome back John Noss and Ian Shelley from Blackline Consulting, who you know from their previous presentations to Council. They'll be presenting what staff has been referring to as Phase 1 of the Service Delivery Review Project, which includes both the Operations Division and the Community Services Department. And just before they get started, I just want to take a few seconds on behalf of the Strategic Management Team to thank the staff that participated in this project. This was a huge undertaking in a very short time frame. It definitely took a collective effort to get us to where we are right now. So I'd really just like to thank staff. SMT recognizes people are our most important asset, and we really thank them for their commitment and dedication to this project and their ongoing commitment to providing quality services to the residents. So with that said, I'd like to welcome both John and Ian. I know they're going to do a bit of a tag team approach on this presentation, so look forward to hearing from them.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Council. As Christine has touched on, John and I are going to do a bit of a tag team tonight. We covered two separate aspects of the operations of the town. I myself focused on operations, John focused on community services. So we've got a general orientation to the work, some specifics on what we identified, and that's what we'll swap between you, and then finish out with some of the recommendations on moving forward that we've put in the report. So, when we set out to do this review, we were invited by the town to look at various aspects of the operations of the organisation.
We look at it through many lenses. We've provided a summary. I think this is something we've talked about previously, that we were looking at what are the services. So we started out with a phase of defining all of the services that fall within the realm, what we refer to as service profiles, sort of single-page snapshots that give us a sense of what goes into it, the service level that's achieved, the financial, the resourcing. We looked at specifically how services are delivered both internally and externally, and there's an operating model review as part of the operations, and community service looked at staffing as well, to look at whether it was structured the right way and how you deliver services. Community service particularly looked at the composition of staffing between full-time, part-time, seasonal, and looked at whether that was balanced correctly. And overall, what we were looking for, even though it says there increased efficiency and effectiveness, we were looking at ways of working differently that would produce better results for the town. So it says efficiency, effectiveness, but predominantly our lens is about, does it have to be done this way? Is there another way of doing it that produces a better result? And hopefully you'll see as when you go through the high priority opportunities, that some of them aren't necessarily efficiency and effectiveness, they're literally responding to improved service levels. It's a very brief snapshot of the division and department that we reviewed and the breakdown that we've used. So community services, 7 portfolios, 11 services, and we went down to 27 what we refer to as sub-services, so the individual services that residents would receive. You can see the total budget there, around $21 million is the budget for community services, of which they recover around $14 million in revenues, leaving a net of about 6.8. On the ops side, we've categorized them into 6 portfolios. Here we're broken down to 31 sub-services in the end. Each one was inspected within those service profiles. Total expenses there, closer to 20 million, with revenues of 7 million, which approximately 50%, if I remember correctly, is from the regional arrangement, leaving a net of around 12 million in expenses within that division. The approach we take to this after reviewing the services is looking for these opportunities to act differently, and we take them from more avenues. So we start with the service profiles, understanding what's delivered. We met with staff and we understand what staff's perspective on the service that they're delivered. In this case, a survey was done with residents and with staff, so we had input from there that we could base them from. And we looked at financial analysis across the department and the division to identify where the costs were and where we thought they were reasonable and reasonable. And this process, it's almost like a funnel that we start with at the top end, trying to identify a large number of things that could be done differently. And then through the project, we refine those down to a smaller number, which has ended up with this 18 high priority. We categorize these into improving service, reducing cost, eliminating waste, and increasing efficiency. I'll focus on the last 2 briefly. The waste concept, even though there's an opportunity around garbage, is things that we're doing that we don't need to be doing, things that are just not good use of our time. The increased efficiency is where we can do the same thing, get the same result, but more efficiently by changing the way we're doing it. Overall, we identified over 40 opportunities between the department and the division, total of 91. And we went through a prioritization process with management to filter down to effectively what we refer to as the top 10. These are the highest priorities, most accessible, recognized by staff as the things they move forward with. And they became the 18 opportunities that we'll profile shortly. The residual were grouped into 2 buckets. I'm going to start with the right, omitted opportunities. This first phase develops all of the ideas. And we go through a validation to say, is there merit to these? When we went through that, there was a number of this 91 opportunities. I think it was less than 20 in the end, John, where with discussion with staff, we concluded there was no merit to moving this forward. There was no substance to it. That left this middle group we've called management opportunities, which we've kept in the report. And so we've elaborated 18. There's around another 30, 40, 50 that management can also take forward and do more work to elaborate and identify additional opportunities that through discussion we consider a lower priority at this point in time. So there is still more work that can be done to advance operations and change the way services are delivered beyond where we are today. When we go through this process, we are quantifying as a first pass a financial impact with them. And part of doing that, in my eyes anyway, is to justify spending any more time on them. If there's limited financial benefit, then we would probably conclude there's not much point moving forward. If we identify financial benefit, then they become a recommendation to move forward, and as the introduction said, to do a more detailed operational analysis on the implementation and the final impact that would be achieved. So we have a figure up there of just over 600,000 in this first preliminary pass of identified savings within those 18 high priority opportunities.
Good evening. The first 10 that I'll go through relate to community services. I think one of the things that I'd mentioned last time we had a session was, as we go through our analysis, one of the jobs that we do is give you the opportunities to look at, but then also what are the options related to them. So as you see in the report, each of the opportunities, we've done analysis to look at, well, what are the different options available. And as you can see, as we go through these, some of them we've said, we've looked at all the options, and these are the ones that we've recommended going forward with. Starting from the top, and I'll just work our way down, invest in energy management. Part of the analysis that we did, especially on the facility side, is utilities is getting more expensive. That's no surprise to anyone at the table. We need to start doing something a bit more about it. Part of the analysis that we all looked at it is, how are you managing energy management today? Who's doing it, qualifications, and so on. And what we concluded is that because this is going to be a growing area, and we imagine that not only the needs around utilities, but also the facilities that you have will increase, it's probably warranted to take a harder look at energy management and investing in that. We also do think that you'd be able to, by investing in it, get some savings out of it as well in terms of long term. Secondly, one of the things that we looked at is community services, unlike other operations across municipality, it doesn't necessarily have legislative standards. So what we looked at and what we worked with the community services and the staff was actually to define what are some of those service standards, what should they be? And there's a couple reasons why. It wasn't necessarily to show increase in performance or enhancements, but also to understand if we change something, what's the impact in terms of resources, in terms of hour of operations, in terms of residents as well. What are they going to see if we adjust some of our standards? So we came up with an initial list of service standards that we believe the community services group can take forward and do a bit more work to bring it down to a more detailed level. We looked at a variety of different facilities, and one of the areas that we looked at were some of the single-purpose facilities. Opportunity 3 was to look at the outdoor pool, and there's research kind of across Canada and North America around what's happening with outdoor pools. In the 70s and 80s, there was a big kind of build-out of them. There's been a lot of discussion around use and what the future use will be. We've put down some analysis around filling it and repurposing it to a park. Option 4, we also looked at some of the other single-purpose facilities, specifically around some of the arenas. The challenge we ran into is when you look at the options for them, you're actually quite constrained with what to do with it. So we did conclude that you just leave it as is. I think down the road, as you build out more facilities, it's looking at what's the purpose of those facilities, what's the longevity of them, to make sure that you don't have any challenges with using those resources. Number 5, we looked at senior center, the operating model around that. We looked at various ways that you could provide senior services, and also with the coming online, the Sherwood Center, there might be opportunities to refocus those senior programs to other newer facilities, so moving them from the Milton Senior Center to other facilities. Number 6, we did some extensive analysis around facilities, studios. We also looked at what is the competition? How do those facilities compete against the private sector, if there is any, in kind of a geographical area, as well as the clientele themselves? One of the things that we also looked at was, how would you repurpose them? What would you repurpose those facilities to? In most cases, what we found is that there actually wasn't a compelling case to do so, at least financially. So beyond that, if it's not economic, then it's going to be related to something else. So we suggest no change. Concession mix, we looked at that. We also looked at the town's current plans with concessions, and actually it looks like a sound plan. We think you should just continue on that and make sure that you continue to measure the outcome of the concession plan that they already have in place. Number 8, we also looked at, as Ian mentioned, around operating model. This one's specific to advertising, and we thought as the town continues to grow, there might be an opportunity to actually look at outsourcing some of the services around advertising. Number 9, we also looked at design and construction, how it's structured today in terms of resourcing, and we felt that there might be an opportunity to change the mix and rebalance it. In that way, you get a bit more of a blend and some opportunities around focusing on the different aspects, which are both indoor and outdoor. And finally, review of recreation and user fees and cost recovery. You've got a robust process around user fees and cost recovery. The one thing that I think the town at one point in time is actually targets. I think targets are a good thing, but also having targets with a range to be able to say, how are we trending against them? So those are final recommendation around community services.
When we look at operations, the first one we started with was garbage in parks and what we could do about reducing the occurrence effectively. We put forward a sort of multi-pronged program there of adding technology to help identify where garbage is so it can be collected more efficiently, to running educational campaigns to dissuade people from arguably dumping household waste in the parks. So our first area was to look at addressing that issue, which is both, it could potentially be a cost saving, but also a service improvement. If there's less garbage dumped, it's less expensive to collect, and it's also a better service for residents. The next two, which you will see occasionally and certainly in the management opportunities, 12 and 13 that we've listed up there, we've referred to them as mutually exclusive. If you do one, you can't do the other. And they relate to staffing models and matching staffing to the peaks and valleys of the workload in the operations department, which is largely a seasonal one. The first one, we looked at what the impact of converting seasonal workers to full-time workers. Now there's pay equity effectively between them. The second one, we looked at better matching when the seasonal workers are not here with when the peaks of workload are, and that's really those changeover months between the seasons and when there is still work to be done on winter maintenance and shift work, and the seasonal workers weren't there. So we looked at swapping those around and the effect. Obviously, if you convert all the seasonal workers to full-time, you can't do opportunity 13. If you choose not to move forward with converting them to full-time, then there's an opportunity to adjust when the seasonal workers are there. 14 is really a management tool, and there's been lots of discussion, not just at this table, but at many other municipalities that we've been to, around the ability to look at forward into the infrastructure that we're putting in place and the impact on operations that is. So this is a workload tool that will arguably allow management to be better prepared to the impact as new infrastructure comes on. And it's a fairly granular, effective. We looked at the volume of infrastructure today, we looked at the staffing that supports that, and use that as a baseline to say, okay, every time we add a kilometre of highway, every time we add a side road, what impact is that on staffing, so that they will have the ability now to better forecast what the impact could be. IT automation for the operations team, I would say, they may not agree, but I would say they are thin on technology supports at the moment. Certainly with the degree of outdoor and mobile working, they have very little technology supporting them with that. So there's a number of items in here around fleet management, inventory management, inspections reporting. There's just providing better information to manage these, better information arguably to reduce inventory on hand, reduced re-entry of information that's captured on paper in the field and re-entered. So there's a business case there around providing electronic supports to the operations division. We looked at fleet. This is referred to as consolidation of fleet vehicles, and we looked at the utilization of fleet through the year, and we took a very balanced view on what an acceptable level of utilization could be between the seasons. We obviously didn't expect the snowplow to be busy all the year round. So we looked at that, and there were a number of vehicles that we felt could be reduced. We also looked at some of the vehicles that could potentially be acquired on a rental basis because the utilization is so low, but we would argue it's a piece of infrastructure, a vehicle you do need to use. But the utilization of them was in the 10s and 20s. So there's a number of vehicles we suggested there could be a rental model that achieves that. We also, on the vehicle front, looked at leasing, and this was an interesting one. Right now, the town procures all of its vehicles outright. When we looked at leasing, to make it economical, then the interest rate on leasing had to be very close to what we consider your borrowing rate today. Part of that, I think, is these are historically low rates. If they were higher, maybe there'd be more margin. But at that rate, we didn't find any examples of people leasing vehicles at those rates at the moment. So we've concluded in here that at this point in time, there isn't a case for leasing vehicles. But obviously, the conditions of leasing vehicles change, and periodically reviewing that would be worthwhile. We also looked, interestingly, at renting vehicles for summer students. They're here for 4 months of the year. And that did look economical. It won't address many vehicles, but there would be a handful of vehicles that you could look at renting during summer months. It very quickly, if it goes beyond 4 months, does not become economical again. So again, there is an opportunity there, but it's quite sensitive to those conditions that if you did change the period of that rental, then it flips to not economical pretty quickly. And the final one we looked at is a direct service improvement. There was a lot of feedback that we received, and I think, anecdotally, given the winter, we expected to receive it, but around getting to side streets sooner. And right now, as we understand it, the side streets are predominantly delivered under a contract, and so we've modeled what an increase to reduce the service time by 30% would reflect on the costs. And so that's literally an investment to deliver a higher service level that relates directly to plowing side streets. There are obviously constraints to that we talked about access to side streets, parked vehicles. And so we did include in this an increase in enforcement around parked vehicles to make it easier to access side streets so that they don't have to be plowed twice, potentially, when the cars are finally moved from their park position. So they're the 8 opportunities that made it on the high priority list for operations.
We've put together a combined timeline. I won't go through the detail around each one of the buckets. Effectively, what we did to come up with the timeline was, 1, are there any dependencies? 2, is there any lead time required around additional analysis, and what might that look like? So you can imagine for some of the IT initiatives, you do need a bit of time to gather requirements, and build out a plan. So that's why we've put that in the medium term. We've also worked with management on this timeline as well to get their input, to understand what's feasible, what makes sense, especially in that first bucket, that short term. So we've put it in 3 tranches. I do always caveat these types of reviews to say management needs to take this away. So if you see, if you agree with the plan, let them take it away and make sure that they can build out a more robust plan around each one of them. As Ian mentioned early on, we've identified a number of opportunities. There's the 18 high priority. There's a number for management to also take forward. There's a considerable amount of change just through this review, and we understand that this is the first of potentially other reviews that the town is undertaking. In our experience, part of the challenge with this is the focal point gets right on the high priority, and the rest of it kind of goes to the wayside. What we're suggesting that, because this is the first service delivery review, to take a real kind of pragmatic approach around thinking longer term and saying, if we are going to be undertaking more change over the course of the next 3 years, we need to set up a governance structure that works around it, because you're going to have various individuals working on some of these initiatives. So we've suggested the town and the management team to come up with a structure that works within the confines of what they think would be most efficient and effective. The final slide that we have, when we do these reviews, there are things that we come across, and it doesn't necessarily fit in any of the buckets of scope that we had, but we did feel was really important. And I think the key thing that we both came across, Ian and I, as we did the review, is both the department and division have a touch point with residents. There's a few things that I think are very important to make sure that there's continuity around that resident experience. Is 1, making sure that departments and divisions across the municipality, culturally, do we have alignment around having that resident-centric view? So making sure that behaviorally, do we have the right culture in mind, and is it consistent across the different areas? There's also alignment, and Ian touched on some of the things earlier around making sure that not just metrics, but also how do those metrics align to how we do things, especially if you change something. If we change the way that we're doing something, what we measured yesterday may not be relevant to how we're doing something today. So we need to make sure that there's appropriate alignment between what people are doing and how they're getting measured. And finally is performance. And performance for me is actually making sure that at the management level, do we have the right metrics, and are we looking at it? Are we looking at the trends? Are we making sure we've got KPIs in place, looking at those service standards to make sure that, are we trending in the right direction? If not, what do we need to change? What are some of the cause? And we feel that's really important across the board. And from community services, that was one of the rationales as well, to really kind of put a focus on those service standards. That's all we had in terms of presentation, so I'll turn it over to questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very well done and very, very necessary as well. Thank you. Now, do any of members of council have questions? Councillor Chandler?
Thanks, Madam Chairman. First of all, I seconded the motion, not to just get it on the floor. I seconded it because I think you've done a great job. I want to thank Christine and Paul and the rest of the team. I like much of what is in the report, and obviously I look forward to implementation. But I just want to say thank you. I have a number of questions. Some are kind of housekeeping. The first one, perhaps you can't answer, I don't know, but just the way that the metrics are shown. And I normally think of revenue as being black and deficits as being red and a minus number behind them. And I think that, you know, much of the world operates in the way I've just described. And this creates, I think, unnecessary confusion. And I'd kind of appreciate Glenn's thought and your thought. You know, should we, given what this document does and who it's directed to, use a more standard financial reporting metric?
I'm an absolute believer in clarity. The clearer you can make it, the better. John will attest to the fact that we argued in the office many times to change the way it was represented. It's presented that way because we believe that's commonly how numbers are presented here. I personally, and this is very much a personal view, would much rather see the change and nothing else. And that's a very personal view. For completeness, it's got current, future. Maybe there's an opportunity, and we'd be happy to take it away if directed, to provide a simplified summary of those, because I think the detail has value for the people who want to look at it, but maybe there is an opportunity to be clearer and focus just directly on the change, up or down.
Great. Yeah, and perhaps you can have a discussion with Glenn. You talked about 30 or 40 or 50 other items that you identified. Were any of them easy wins? Were any of them the kind of thing that could be done in an interim basis, or perhaps provide some financial benefit, but not a priority, but could make life better?
Yeah, through your worship. Part of when we do the analysis and we kind of put them in the buckets, the high priority versus kind of the other, that you should maybe do something about it, but it's not for us, is exactly that. They're more tactical. And in most cases, what we find is, do you need justification to do that piece of work? So that we don't do the analysis around the financial benefit for the other management. You're absolutely right, there could be, either direct in terms of dollar savings or efficiency, so building more capacity. So there absolutely are probably opportunities in that you'd have additional savings or efficiency. But in terms of our time, we can only focus on so many, so that's why we put it in that category.
And it's kind of a related question with respect to the 18 you identified. Do you or staff find any of those matters, for example, an opportunity for a fast track, or in putting them together to just sort of think, you know what, this is the logical way to do it, and there really isn't an opportunity to fast track at this point?
Through your worship, I'll speak on the community services side. I don't think so, to be honest. I think some of them, the ones which are further out in the 36, kind of month range, there is a bit of legwork that needs to happen between then and there. But Ian, I don't know if you want to comment on operations side.
I think from the list, there's a couple in there that do require legwork, like the garbage in parks requires some research and investment, the IT requires some investment, so there's a timeline there. I think the ones that potentially could move more quickly might be related to staffing, and the seasonal staffing, that could, because that's almost decision-based, so they could certainly move relatively quickly, and I believe they were in the first bucket to move on.
They were.
And off the top of my head, The fleet is more difficult because that would be likely over time rationalization. You wouldn't just arguably dispose quickly. So I think that's, with the operations one, most of them have a set of activities to get you to an endpoint, but the staffing is probably the ones that can move more quickly.
Okay. You indicated that you looked at alternative service options related to a couple of the items. One was the gymnasium, the weight studio. Did you look at any other alternative service options that may involve the private sector or another municipality or some other delivery?
Mr. John, could you please speak closer to the mic? We can barely hear you.
Sorry. From an operations perspective, yes, we went through each of the services that are delivered today, and we looked at relatively whether we felt the right amount of that service was being delivered internally versus externally. So I think, if I remember correctly, somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% of the services are currently contracted out from operations. And so we looked at those contracts, we looked at the cost of effectiveness of those contracts relative to internal service delivery where they existed, and we went through every service. And there are some recommendations in one of the sections of the report that look at adjustment on some of those. The level of detail we had to do that review does require management to go to the next level and say, okay, what are the actual tasks that are in or out with this? We were looking at a contract as a whole and saying this is a contract for winter maintenance. So it does require management to go in at the next level of detail and say, look, let's look at exactly the specific task. So we went through every service on the operations side to look at that.
When you looked at converting seasonal workers, did that include considering pensions and benefits, or was it just salary?
The seasonal workers did include benefits, and that really swayed the case. So the trade-off we were looking at was the effort internally to bring on board the seasonal workers each year, whether that's training, certifications, licenses, everything else. What we found is when you move them into full-time positions, it becomes much more marginal because of the benefits side of it. So it did include the benefits and pension.
The community engagement, by my reckoning, was pretty low. Essentially, out of a community of 130,000 people, you had 327 responses. And I'm not even sure it was that high when you look at the town response as well, in terms of our full-time employee complement and 127 responses. Does that concern you at all, or were the responses of a quality that gave you some sense that it was probably okay?
I answer that along a few lines. I think the responses we received we use as directional. So the first question, is it representative of the community? I couldn't be certain, so we use them as directional. In terms of the numbers you received, 327, in our experience in going to the community with these sort of things, that's not a bad number for these. It was an online survey with limited promotion running for a short time. So whilst I'm not, I can't be certain that it's representative, I think it's not uncommon for those volume of numbers. On the staff side, I think you'll find there's a bias that many of the respondents were in the department or division, and I suspect that many of the people who weren't didn't feel they had much to offer. So if you sort of subdivide the organization down, the staff number looks a much higher percentage when you think of it that way. So they don't, as numbers that I feel they're reasonable. Could you feel they were entirely representative of the community? No, I'd want to see other viewpoints to draw that conclusion.
One thing that concerned me, and perhaps it concerned you when you saw it, and perhaps staff as well, perhaps Christine was concerned, was the net loss in terms of community service expenses is increasing. Revenues are increasing, total expenses are increasing, but the delta is getting wider. Obviously, you look at that and say, hey, maybe we need a core services review. But did you draw any other conclusions from that?
Through your worship. Yes. One of the things that we spent a lot of time on is you're a growing municipality. You've got new facilities coming on board. You've got, I think, a young community as well. So there's appetite to use more of those programs. So costs are going up. We spent quite a bit of time, and I think as you look at the opportunities around community services around how can we reduce some of those costs. One of the things that we did talk quite a bit about as well, which is around process improvement. And I think that's going to be another one. unlike ops, we didn't have an opportunity related to technology because it's already on kind of the agenda, if you will, for community services. And I do think those are going to be the two levers to help be efficient as you grow. But I think part of what you'll find, I imagine, with the costs and revenue is that as you grow, it will be kind of peaky and valley on the community services side, which isn't uncommon.
There was a comparison with respect to community services work volume is increasing. And what I was wondering, and I saw your appendix did a lot of comparisons with other municipalities, other jurisdictions, quite frankly, throughout North America, which I thought was quite useful. But I was wondering how we're doing in terms of when you look at our ratios at other municipalities that are of a similar size, perhaps growing similar to the way we're growing in the province of Ontario or perhaps in other provinces. Did you have an opportunity to sort of look at our comparators?
Through your worship, we looked at comparators in a variety of different ways and much more targeted, and I think that's probably as you read the report and now that you get the voiceover, we use them in specific areas where we thought it'd be interesting to draw some conclusions. I think the challenge that we typically would find with municipality like the town of Milton is the growth that you have. It's very difficult to compare the growth with yourselves and other municipalities. So where we could and where we thought it was valuable, we applied the peer analysis.
I asked the question is that, you know, without a comparison, it may be normal, but it might not be, and at least, you know, by looking at other municipalities, it gives you perhaps some sense, perhaps not even legitimate, but you know, at least you've got some comparison to make.
Through your worship, just to close out on that, I think the one thing for me, and we started the conversation with Christine about how do you grow efficiently. Like that has got to be it, because there's appetite through the survey you saw. There's appetite for programs and services, and I don't think that's a surprise to anyone here. It's a young community, and for me, it's how do you grow efficiently, and that's got to be the mantra for community services.
In the area of energy investment, and you're recommending a full-time hire to manage it, and you know, you were. I thought it was this was very well done, but I had one question around, I think we've all been hit in business at some point in time with a telephone call from a consultant who offers to cover the cost of their work in the savings that you will accrue through the deployment of their technology. Did you think about that, and how do you respond to that?
Yeah, through your worship. One of the things we looked at, and I think it was option 3, I'm just looking at my notes here, for energy management, which is to get a consulting firm to come in, you know, periodically. They'll come in, do an analysis, you know, may be able to identify some opportunities for savings. You can definitely do that, and I think it is a viable option. I think the challenge is that, one, you've got an estate that you need to continually manage, and there's also grant money that comes up. And I think that's the other side of it. Is not necessarily keeping you efficient, but also there's things that you might have access to that without the right skill set you might not get access to. So that's why we landed on the energy management. But yeah.
Okay. Do you think it's worthwhile for us to take a look at the consultant who will find savings worth more than his value, or is that not?
Through your worship, absolutely. And I imagine when you hire someone that's an energy, efficiency expert, they're going to be able to even say, here's the top 5 consulting firms that I'd want to work with, or software companies, whatever that technology is. I'd expect them to bring that knowledge to the table as well, to say, these are the ones we should be spending more time investigating, and others that we don't need to.
Okay. I know that there's a lot more work coming back with respect to the outdoor pool at Rotary Park. But the comment here about people going 20 kilometers or 24 kilometers to use an outdoor pool, how realistic or feasible is that?
Through your worship, depending on the area, I think one of the challenges that we find is many residents either have access to a pool through a friend, or they go away on weekends. So there's a lot of cottage country traveling. So for me, the small minority to drive 20 minutes I think it's feasible for some. There's going to be some that aren't going to, it's not going to be palatable at all. But again, I think we did the analysis. We wanted to bring the options forward for you guys to make the difficult decision.
Yes, you're right.
Any further, Councillor Chandler? Any more questions?
I have a lot more questions.
Okay.
So on the MSAC, MSAC, volunteers, I guess a general question. Again, did we look at other municipalities to see, you know, how they're deploying volunteers in their operations? I mean, I remember, you know, some years ago, and it might have been the 90s, Hazel McCallion made a comment about how if the city of Mississauga didn't have the volunteer contingent that it did both inside and outside of the organization, they couldn't operate. And I get the sense reading this that we would also have an issue. But, you know, what is our complement versus other similar municipalities in terms of the percentage of volunteers that we rely on to get things done?
Through your worship. A lot of other municipalities have the benefit of a strong volunteer contingent, and I think the benefit that you have that I haven't necessarily seen at others is some of the services they provide. You know, it's quite beneficial. So at the Arts Centre, for example, that's quite beneficial for yourselves. So in terms of overall, I think it's in line. I'm just thinking through the number that we've worked with. The one thing for me is making sure that do you have a good volunteer program? Because that, for me, is you want to be able to continue to rely on that, or at least have a good understanding of if there's going to be a drop, how are we going to, you know, mitigate that risk.
But do you not think we should benchmark so that we know, you know, if we're in the ballpark, if we're too reliant, if we're being unrealistic?
Through your worship, you can. I think the challenge that you'll find is what are they using the volunteers for? Because each municipality, as I recall some of the ones that we've worked with, you know, some of them only use them on specific issues or opportunities and events. I know, having worked with one of your neighbors recently, they use them in specific areas and only specific areas. So, yeah.
My next area of questioning is around the senior center. And essentially, what is being recommended here is that we not have a senior center moving forward. Again, I go back to our comparators in the province of Ontario and perhaps in other jurisdictions that you've had experience with. You know, how many municipalities of our size don't have a senior center and are offering, you know, services alternate ways?
Through your worship, there's a number. To be honest, it's a mixed bag. You're going to have different operations across Ontario. So, in and around Toronto, everything from having a dedicated senior center to it's, you know, given to a third party, and there's, you know, subsidized or assistance from the municipality. So there's really a mixed bag. I think for me, it's what makes sense for this town, and that's what we wanted to look at. What are some of the changes that are happening? In terms of some of the regional aspects, as well as with your new facilities coming online. And for me, also just taking an economic view of it, how can we maybe potentially offer them better programs and newer facilities?
With respect to Rotary Park Pool, sorry, ahead of myself, the fitness studios. One thing I was looking for here, and this is quite frankly a revelation for me. I certainly when we talked, I was one that felt that the private sector should be seriously considered here. Madam Chair, when we opened up the Milton Leisure Center and we put in the fitness studio, it was not meant to be forever. The reason why we set aside space was we didn't have the private sector participating in terms of offering that service in this community. We were too small. We weren't attracting that kind of business. But here we are, and we have, as you know, you looked, a lot of private sector operators in Milton. And so I was surprised that when you look at the financials, it actually is of benefit financially. And I'm assuming that includes all the capital costs and the cost to physically operate, you know, electrical and heating and cooling and all that kind of stuff.
Through your worship, yes, that's correct.
So, obviously there's going to be more work done on that as we go through this, and that's one of the reasons why I am supportive. The other area that I was surprised was the concessions, because I don't think it's any secret that we've had a challenge in that regard. And I guess from what I draw from what you wrote, if we wanted to change the level of service for the concessions, then that would change this discussion possibly.
Through your worship, yes.
Again, I look to you to tell me how many municipalities of our size today are operating their concessions largely using vending machines.
Through your worship, it's actually interesting. The numbers, I was actually surprised to see your numbers because they're actually quite healthy in some cases. So that was a bit of a surprise. A lot of other municipalities are moving towards vendors or third parties to run certain concessions.
Okay. In operations, I wasn't surprised by the response, although it was low in terms of the level of satisfaction. Generally, I think people are satisfied. There are specific issues, and I think, quite frankly, your recommendation with respect to snow removal is a good one, and will help, I think, a lot when it is enacted. Garbage in parks, I agree with you there. There's got to be a better way, and I'll make a general comment and a question of you with respect to education about all the services that we undertake in the municipality to the benefit of the residents here. I'm kind of curious as to what your view is about what you know today about how we communicate to residents. You identified in portion, based on this specific discussion, what you saw as an issue. But did you see education or public communication on a continuous basis of benefit in other areas that you investigated?
I'd have to say within the scope of this work, it's not something that came up as a specific issue from any of the sources that communication was a general problem. What we felt in looking at garbage is there was a number of examples, as close by as the City of Toronto running active campaigns to get residents to do the right thing with what they throw away. City of Toronto's problem is predominantly what goes in recycle. And they have a terrible rate at which they recover recycles, so that's where they focus. But it seems as though it's something that, we provide a couple of other examples, that has been used in the area of garbage, and that's where we focused in on that not just, the enforcement piece, but another way to stop the garbage coming out in the first place. So it wasn't generally a feature of the feedback that we received.
Yeah, and as I understand it, you're going to be looking at other departments, and perhaps that investigation is more suitable because we have other departments that have more of a responsibility for that undertaking. Madam Chairman, you'll be happy to know this is my last question. Discussions with Human Resources and the CAO about, particularly about the cost aspects that you're proposing and the people aspects that you're discussing. My assumption is that that your expectation is that HR will be fully engaged in this process, may lead sections of it, perhaps, I don't know. And obviously the CEO is going to have to take leadership in terms of the larger high-level organizational changes that you're proposing in terms of, to the point that you made about it's great, to implement, but then how do you follow up and ensure that it continues? And to me, that's a function of leadership. So I guess I'm kind of curious, as my closing question to you guys, what do you see as the responsibility of Human Resources? What do you see as the responsibility of the CAO's office? What do you see as the responsibility of senior staff?
It's not something we've discussed previously, so if John has a different viewpoint, we are a partnership. Almost. I'm going to start on a slightly different point. We did put in the report a discussion, albeit brief, around a governance model. So rather than direct responsibility, we do feel that these things are successful where there is some form of oversight, whichever you choose that oversight to be. The second phrase, which I trot out frequently, is all the people you see from the city here, from the town today, have a full-time job already. So if you're going to move change initiatives like that, the resourcing needs to be considered.
Once that governance body was in place, I'd expect a number of initiatives to be defined, and certainly I would look to that seat as being the head of that governance program. Whether that involves HR or not would be down to the initiative, but it should be staffed with the right representatives from the organisation. And whilst we've reviewed both operations and community services, that doesn't mean that all responsibility should just fall to those groups. You know, there's opportunities that will span other departments. I mean, the IT one's an easy one to point out. So I would suspect that through that governance body, I'd like to see the formation of specific teams that are dealing with the initiatives. And the final thought I'd offer is you're taking a phased approach to this. At the moment, this is phase one. It's one division, one department. Some of these opportunities may need more rapid investigation in some of the other departments, because it might be far more efficient to look at them across the whole organisation than pick them off piecemeal as well. So it's just another complexity. You see some municipalities who try and do service delivery reviews across their entire scope, which I find is typically thinner. You're going phase by phase and getting deeper, I think, but there's still that connectivity that will need to come about. So whoever you form into the governance body has a little bit of a prickly problem to start with, to think about how do we move forward with this effectively. Albeit there might be some quick wins that we can just get moving while we work that out, and I'd certainly advocate that wherever possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Chandler. Thank you to the presenters. I have next up Councillor Hamid.
Well, thank you. A lot of my questions have already been asked, so just a couple of quick clarifications. Page 89 talked about winter maintenance costs and how it's higher in Milton compared to other municipalities. I know this report talked about some stuff, but I just wanted to hear from staff, do we have any theories as to why? And if not, is there a timeline when we can have a better idea of why that's the case?
Theories? Through you, Madam Chair, I think there's a lot of different things that go into winter control that are, it's just not a cut and dry operation. We have a very wide range of geographic area, right from Highway 7 down to the 403. So we have a lot of different change in our climate across that because of the differences in elevation. It could be snowing in Brookville and we could have sunny skies on lower baseline. We have the regional roads that we have a very high level of service that we provide for. So that's a cost or an operation for us. We already contract out a great deal of our services, and when we look at through the analysis that we've done through this report, all of the regional local municipalities, Burlington, Oakville, Halton Hills, and ourselves, we all have a higher than average contracted service. So I don't think there's any additional savings to be had in that area, or maybe those are driving our costs up because of the insurance that the private sector has to pay. I'm not sure. So I can't give you a definite answer. We will continue to review. We will strive to always provide the best level of service that we can, the most economically way we can provide it. And we're going to look at these proposed level of service changes with Council's blessing to see if we can implement those in the not too distant future.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions, Madam Chair. Rotary Park Pool, the recommendation to convert it or close it, was it based on cost alone, or was it other factors like we could use the area better? Because if it's cost alone, I suspect community park would carry a cost as well.
Through your worship, it wasn't just cost. We also looked at, you've got Sherwood, which is opening up pools as well. So we also looked at participation and a few other things. So we also looked at just the land itself and say, what could it be used for? Because that's the other question, which is if you just fill it and don't do anything, what would you want to do with it? It's already got a splash pad there, which is great. So we looked at a number of different things.
Now, the garbage in park area, education doesn't really work. So I was surprised to read that the report thought there was going to be 20% reduction based on education. Do we have any data from other municipalities? Because in my experience, people who are violating, people who are dumping household garbage in bins, they don't really care about education. It's not that they don't know, they just don't care.
When it comes to dumping, we would probably agree if it's household dumping that it's done with a very clear purpose in mind. We found examples of some other municipalities, and if I remember correctly, I think it was Edmonton or Calgary, where they're estimating they're going to get 50% reduction from education alone. So we took that figure way down to get to the 20%, but it is an estimate. And with this challenge, we don't have any data at the moment of even what volume is dumping in parks. Much of it is, anecdotal and staff evidence. There's no empirical data on volume or frequency, that sort of thing. So that one particularly, it's based on assessments, and we've tried to be estimates, and we've tried to be very clear of what those estimates are. And certainly, if there was data that could support the estimates, we'd update the figures accordingly.
Okay, I have some other questions, but I'll wait for everybody else to ask to see if if others ask them. But just one quick comment, I guess. I wouldn't really want to see us spending a whole lot of money on education, but I'd love to see some enforcement, the camera ideas or any other enforcement ideas on household dumping. One question I did have was around smart garbage technology. Mr. Mayor mentioned AMO. I saw that in AMO about 8 years ago, and at that time, there weren't a whole lot of municipalities that had used it, so we didn't pursue that. I'm not sure if other municipalities have used such a technology or not. I know one model I saw actually had a compactor built in that compacted garbage, so you didn't have to clear it as often. And because this isn't just a cost-saving issue, it's a big concern from residents as well, especially in summer when you have overflowing garbage that attract flies and mosquitoes and everything else. So are these smart garbages used anywhere else in the area that we can learn from?
In reviewing it, we didn't find any nearby examples of where it's been adopted, and I think particularly for this example, it was brought forward very much to address the specifics of the problem. And so that's why we put it forward. It's growing in usage, but as you say, it's not a common technology, and we didn't find any nearby municipalities. There's much more evidence in the US of usage there. The other factor that we brought forward is a technical one, which is the use of what's referred to as mesh networks, where each of them is talking to each other, and only with that do we think it's an economical model as well. And that's a technology that's really only receiving any sort of time in the last 3 years or so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hamid. Next up, I have Councillor Cluett.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thanks very much for your presentation, your report. It was a pleasure working with you during this whole process, and the feedback that not only from senior staff but also from the staff in general here at the Town of Milton was quite positive. And again, we'll continue to thank our senior manager and especially our employees over this course, because it has been a very stressful process, and it's been well worthwhile, and some things that we wish we had done a lot sooner. So I agree with a lot of the comments. I know that were many questions so far. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, I'll go through the list. When you were introducing the service standards, basically it was just a comment that most businesses introduce that service standard, and I think it serves a double purpose. And I think I'm echoing. I don't know if I am or not, sorry. I think it serves a double purpose. One is obviously standards for our employees, but also to set expectations of the residents and the taxpayers as well. We have a lot of people coming from more mature cities and more mature municipalities, and when I was in Mississauga, we got this, and now we get this. And so I think having these types of service standards is good for not only our employees, but also for us to manage the expectations. Can you get a little bit, is that in your experience, is that what you've had?
Through your worship, absolutely. For me, it's also making sure that everyone has let's call it a baseline, a good understanding of what our services are internally and externally. 1, for communication, 2, for consistency, and 3, to make sure if we need to change something, heating of a pool, for example, what are the implications of that? A great example is if the pool of the heat rises, might be great for the elderly, but for the ones that are doing Olympic swimming, it's too hot, it's unhealthy. So for me, it's a prime example to show that we need to understand the consequences of those changes.
Thank you. And further down the list here, I won't go into all of them because I know some of them have already been touched on. One is, maintaining the planned concession mix. And there are other municipalities in the Halton region that have, let's say, a community center or a sports center, a multi-rink path, a multi-pad facility, but they also have a private sector, let's say a restaurant or a bar or a pub or some other private sector style concessions. Was that considered as well through this process?
Through your worship, yes, we looked at third parties as well, and I think part of the challenge is you need to attract, or sometimes they'll come forward to yourselves. So that's one kind of implication or challenge that you have. The second is, as a municipality, what type of service do you want to provide at the concessions? And some other municipalities across Ontario are having more of a healthy food and healthy drink, and even in the vending machines to move away from that. I think the other thing that's really changed over time is concessions and vending machines. They've changed as well. I've had some actually pretty decent coffee come out of a vending machine recently. So that has all shifted as well to where you get a point where some municipalities, if they're making money off the concessions, or if they find that it's needed because it creates a community atmosphere, then they're fine with having a loss. And others, it's just purely economic, and they're saying, we don't need it.
And going forward, the quick comments about the garbage in the parks, I think almost since many of us have been elected, that's the first thing, the comments that we get from residents, and we see it in Ward 3 along Louis St. Laurent. As we go from the Metro shopping mall down to Craig Kielburger High School, we have 3 containers. I can put dollars to donuts, and I did last Sunday as well. Garbage was filled up in those receptacles because it is a non-garbage pickup week for Halton Region, so all 3 of those receptacles were actually filled with household waste. Education, we can do so much. We have big stickers on them. Our Commissioner, Mr. Cripps, actually had, I think it was about last year or the year before, had most of our garbage bins with a big bylaw saying this is illegal, don't do it, and still it happens. So the enforcement side is definitely, I think, the way to go on that one. One of the comments that was made about the low turnout, I guess a low turnout, or the low participation from the public, could you attest that to, because, you know, for most of the times in public life, if things are going well, we don't hear very much, but when things are going bad or rotten or they disagree with it, that's when we usually hear. Is that something you can attest to? Because I know that those who did, there was a high percentage of people that thought everything was good, the service levels were good, so I just wanted to see if you found that in previous work.
Through your worship, typically what we find is quite polarized. You'll see certain issues where they're either, you know, very pro, they're very happy, so they're, you know, it's usually one or the other. There's usually very little in the middle. So it's usually quite binary in terms of the results. And to Ian's point earlier, it is difficult. We've done surveys, we've done electronic surveys, we've done printed surveys in town halls and civic centers and so on. And it's a real challenge to get, you know, a substantial turnout unless you're going door to door or it's, you know, kind of voting season. So yeah, in terms of the outcome, I think it was a decent outcome. It's in line with a lot of the other reviews that we've done.
Makes me feel a little bit comfortable. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll have some questions of staff afterwards.
Thank you, Councillor Clerk. Next up, we have Councillor Tesser-Dirksen.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our presenters for this report. I really tried to kind of read between the lines a little bit in some of the stuff that you wrote. I'm going to start with the volunteers. It's already been brought up, but I want to just very candidly ask, do you think we're relying too much on volunteers? We've seen a real drop in volunteers, service clubs. It seems to be a paradigm shift with the way people view volunteering. Are we relying too much? Are we putting ourselves at risk by relying too much on the good nature of volunteers coming forward?
Through your worship, I think if people want to volunteer, I think it's great. So first of all, you know, I wouldn't say close the doors at any point in time. If you have a drop, I would expect that your volunteers are going to have a blip. I wouldn't expect that it's necessarily going to be steady, that you are going to see some peaks and valleys, partly because you've got overall an aging community. So you may see that actually there's a rise in the next few years. Are you too reliant on them? As we put in the report, for me, I want to make sure that you're aware of the risks. And I think right now you have a great volunteer base. If you were to lose 30%, could you still operate? Absolutely. What you benefit from volunteers is actually, I would almost say, an increase in service standard. So if I use the art gallery, you know, an exhibit, you could probably have 10 people working the coat check, Whereas, do you really need 10? You could probably actually operate with 5 that are actually paid. So for me, it's more about understanding what the risks are associated if you do have a massive drop-off. I do think there's ways to mitigate it. We put down some numbers to say that if you did have a substantial drop, you'd have to pick up some part-times. The risk there is effectively cost. And for me, it highlights the fact that you need to promote, your volunteers and have a good, solid kind of volunteer program to manage that.
Thank you. I will mention the senior center briefly. I think it's a great idea, actually. I feel like having a physical senior center just it adds to the stratification of residents based on age. And I like the fact that you highlighted literature that tells us mixing ages together, integrating them is better, especially seniors today aren't like seniors were yesterday, I feel. They're more modern, there's more of them, and they like to be more involved with the community as a whole, not just kind of isolated. So thanks for mentioning that. The last thing I'm going to touch upon is actually going towards the end of the report on page 131 when you talk about the implementation plan. I'm really interested in the interactions you had with our staff. They really kind of are on the front lines of bringing these services to our residents, and we rely on them hugely. And I don't really have a question articulated, but I do want to get maybe some clarification or elucidation on some of the things you mentioned here when you talk about culture, alignment, performance, and again, trying to read between the lines. You mentioned incentive programs and that sort of thing. Is this based on experience you've had in other municipalities? Is there something unique to us that has influenced your recommendation here?
You said you hadn't crafted one question. I think there's 10 there. But I'm going to pick on the performance one because that's the easiest one. And I think it's touched on in other places of the report. Is this unique to yourselves? No. But there is, in the municipalities we've worked with in the last 24 months, a growing desire for better performance measures. And the thing that I tend to pick on is the difference between an activity and an outcome, in the sense that I did it 10 times is not a performance measure. There's no garbage there is a performance measure. And that's really underlying that one particular suggestion. And that sort of plays into the culture comment as well, that moving those sort of things is about the organization and the culture of the organization and the values of the organization. There's an alignment point that John talked about is there a consistent viewpoint and is there a consistent culture that flows through all of the organization? I believe, and I'm looking at John at this one, there was a piece of work done around customer excellence that we talked about and how that informs and whether that's fully embedded in the organization. That was really where the culture point came from, was around consistency. And then the performance, if there is a desire to change some of the performance, how do you do that in an organization? You don't just go around and say, here's the new performance measures. So that's really where many of those comments came from.
If I can just add to that. Part of what was interesting with this review is that there were actually certain touch points between operations and community services, where a given process, you might deal with one of them and then end up dealing with the other. And for me, we call it customer journey mapping, but what's the experience as a resident or as a customer to move from handling from one side of the department to another, and is it consistent? And I imagine as you do more of these service reviews, you're going to see what those touch points are and where there might be different interactions and experiences.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Next, we have Councillor Melboff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, most of the questions I had and concerns have already been raised, but just a couple of quick questions, and basically it'll be yes or no answers. Concerning Rotary Pool Park, the outdoor pool, were you informed of Council's decision or direction that we gave staff during the 2019 budget debate about no longer consider closing Rotary Park?
Through your worship, yes.
You were advised. Okay, thank you. Now, in the operating differences that we saw in the winter maintenance programs, did you contact those other municipalities to ascertain whether the issue was the way we calculate it versus actual costs?
We did not.
Okay, thank you.
And if I can just elaborate slightly, it was not through lack of desire but volume of work that we're working to a very tight deadline, and without it being during a winter season, it's difficult to get to some of the operational realities. So at that point, we could identify there was a difference in the data. Given the way the data looks, it's my strong belief it's about what's reported and not necessarily an operational matter. But until we could get to municipalities and go through that process, then we wouldn't be able to ascertain that difference.
Okay, and then, so based on your report, concerning the fitness and weight room, your position is that we as a municipality should continue to compete directly against those private sector businesses operating within our community that provide the same service?
Through your worship, yes.
That's all the questions I have, but you can put me down on the list for comments.
Thank you, Alden. Okay, and next is we have Councillor Best.
No questions, just comments later.
Okay.
After Councillor Melville.
Thank you. So we'll move on to His Worship Gord Krantz.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And again, I'm not hesitant to make my comments known at this point in time, because there's never a good time to, address things. So this is the time. Madam Chair, if we could go to either page 33 by our numbering or page 15 by the consultant's numbering. And I'm going to go right to the top here. While being fiscally responsible is important, cost cutting is not the primary objective of this review. I agree with that. But I'm just wondering if savings should be in there someplace. Isn't this what this is about, or some of it's about? I don't want to talk around it. I want to talk about it.
Through your worship, I think what we've laid out is part of the intention with the wording is that not to just focus in on the numbers. Because as you go through each of the opportunities, I think each one what we've tried to represent is a story around what is the economic situation, what are the numbers related to each opportunities. So for me, the statement that the intent behind that statement is to say, let's not just focus on the numbers, let's also make sure we look at everything else around efficiency and service improvements.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I usually attempt to keep away from weasel words. Okay, not to suggest that any that you're using is weasel words, but I know how they work. I've been a politician for quite some time, and I use them all the time, so I know how it works. Now, Madam Chair, there's areas in this here report that I have doubt about, but there's areas in this report that I think there's a lot of merit in as well there too. And a lot of them, in my opinion, are no-brainers. As an example, it's been mentioned several times, Rotary Park, Rotary Pool, closing that, doing away with the senior center. Like, give me a break. It ain't going to happen. So I don't want to mislead anybody for a moment. Because, Madam Chair, what I'm going to suggest, and I know you have a resolution there appropriately moved and seconded, I'm going to be suggesting, a little amendment or little fine-tuning of that, hopefully, so we don't get ourselves into a great deal of difficulty. Because at least in my opinion, if it's passed just the way it is here right now, guess what's liable to happen? And then, we're all in trouble, including me, by allowing it to happen. I don't intend to cherry-pick this report. I'm not going to do it. Mention was made before by the consultant with leadership and staff leadership. I totally agree with that. But the buck stops with us elected people. This is where leadership starts and stops when it comes to running a municipality. So would you agree with that?
Through your worship, yes, I would.
Okay. So keeping that in mind. So I think, Madam Chair, that's all at this point. And again, at the appropriate time, I have a suggestion for the resolution, and hopefully keeping out of trouble in the future.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Chair, by the way, I supported this review too. You know.
Thank you. Good to know. Madam Clerk, are we going to move to an amendment now? Okay, are there any more questions? Or we can move to comments?
I think I was on your second list. Just the question was asked by Z about is there any technology in Canada today that deals with waste? And there is. The City of Halifax on the waterfront has a technology called Big Belly. They're solar powered, they're computer operated, and they can tell you what the situation is with beverage containers, with waste, as well as with organics, because it collects all three. And it's been in place now for, well, I was involved in the pilot, so sometime probably 2011, 2012. They're expensive. At that time, they were about somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 each. But an audit was done, and very effective. But I will say, in defense of public education, it was a significant factor in the acceptance of the technology, and I look at what we had done that time in British Columbia and in Manitoba, and we were spending roughly between $1 and $2 per resident on public education around littering and recycling. And I think that the executive directors of the organization that had that responsibility would tell you that, because they told me, the success of those programs was not due as much to the technology as it was to the public education. So I certainly agree with your comment about enforcement. Don't get me wrong. You got to have enforcement. But I think you've got to be proactive, and that's where public education comes in place. And I think that, yes, there certainly is a cost associated with technology and garbage bins, but is it worthwhile? You'll do the analysis and let us know, I guess.
Through your worship, yeah, I think Ian touched on it. In the U.S., there's some prevalence there. It's also in Europe, especially in metropolitan areas. I was in Florence, for example, and they've got weighted garbage cans, and they actually will do their route based on the weight. So they're able to do that. So the technology's there. It's just, is it economic for you, and is it suited for the areas that you have it as well?
Thank you. Okay, I have Councillor Malbuff.
Time for comments, right? No more questions, just for comments.
Yes, comments, please. Yes, so we're done with the delegations. Thank you so much for your presentation and answering all the questions. It's very informative. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the comments now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Unlike some members of council, I'm not impressed with what I've seen here so far. I have some issues and major concerns, but I'm not going to get into all of them. When I consider the recommendation to close Rotary Park and close the senior center, I have a problem with that. Council has been quite clear on where we stand on Rotary Park, and I'm surprised that it's in this report. Then there's a section about maintaining staying in the business of the fitness room and weight rooms. Again, we should not be using tax dollars to provide a service that is being provided by the private sector. We're using their tax dollars to compete against them, and that, to me, that's wrong. The other area that I have a concern is the report highlights the substantial higher costs that Milton seems to be paying versus other municipalities concerning winter maintenance. But my concern is that the consultant never contacted these other municipalities to confirm, where the discrepancy is. Is it the way we calculate versus them? I would have thought that since that was in this report, that next step should have been taken, so we have those findings here. Again, everybody knows where I stand on using consultants. All right? I believe there's a lot of times we hire consultants when we could be doing the job ourselves. And this, again, is another argument I believe supports my case. I believe that, based on what I see here, I believe that we as members of council, sitting down with senior management team, with an outreach program to our staff, could have come up with a better set of recommendations than what we have here. And if it was up to me right now, I would put a stop to this process and move in that direction. Okay? Now, just a clarification from staff or from the CEO, if this motion passes, which I suspect it will, okay, none of these recommendations can be implemented until it comes back to council, right? Nothing happens. It's almost like a receipt for information, correct? Okay, thank you.
I know you have a speakers list, and I think I mentioned that I had some suggestions because I'm really concerned about that. So Madam Chair, do you want to hear that now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to suggest, Madam Chair, and I apologize, I know I'm out of order, but the very first paragraph, I get a little concerned when you start supporting something in principle. It's like being a little bit pregnant. Either you are or you're not. So we're either supporting this or you're not. So that's really what it comes down to. But what I'm going to suggest in the second paragraph, where it says the staff be directed to provide an update to council, not only the update and a decision to be made by council on any of those items. And I'm not talking, and you heard me mention there before that there's merit in a lot of this. I'm not talking about some little, thing, and I'm not going to single anything out. But as an example, Rotary Park and Senior Center as an example. I don't want staff saying we're going to implement this because you approved it here, even though we'll give you an update. I don't want an update. I want this council to be part of that decision making, if that's going to be closed or not. So I just want to make sure that that's properly captured, and the clerk can maybe assist on the proper wording in that. But that's the intent of where I'm going with the amendment, or, to be included by the mover and seconder of the motion. So thank you.
Thank you, Worship. Is there any members of staff who want to speak to that? Because my understanding is that is understood with this motion, that council will have the final say, but we are just asking to add the wordings.
Well, it doesn't say that, though. We're just going to be updated. But anyway, as long as it's very clear.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have Councillor Best up next.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and I agree with the Mayor. And council has to be involved, and I agree with the concerns that Councillor Malsbuff and Challoner have raised, because this is something that's the next step. In principle, I'm agreeing with this. Council knows where I stand on various issues on this, but some of them philosophical, and that's where we have to make that decision. Staff can only go so far in their recommendations. We have to decide, is this the business we want to be in? In terms of energy efficiency, we could also look at other services. Milton Hydro has a number of people that are, right into saving money. And as some of the councillors that went to the EMO conference, the LAS service provides consulting services for energy efficiencies. We can use them as well as have someone to implement. I can understand where staff are coming. They don't have a person that basically be there to train staff to do things, but a lot of this work can be done by people that we are associated with. In regards to the review, well, we have another review coming, and I'll be mentioning that under the regional business.
Thank you, Councillor West. Next, I have Councillor Mike Clute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I had a couple of more questions, but they were directed to staff about the report. And one of the things, I guess I'll ask the questions first, and I'll just do another quick comment about the fitness. And I understand where Councillor Malbuff and I've shared these concerns before. Through the report, it talks about the weight rooms at the Milton Leisure Center, but it doesn't make any mention of the programming that's involved also at the Milton Leisure Center. And I'll be more specific, and I'll use a specific example. There's a number of companies, small business operated companies, who do Zumba as their business. And they have to rent some of our facilities, whether it be the old Bruce Street Library or other different facilities around town, So they charge people $10 admission or $15 or whatever it is, and yet the town facilities, and I can't remember if the leisure center has this or not, but then the town facilities will provide free Zumba for people in the community, and that's where I have a problem with. There's private sector there's a number of companies out there providing that service, but yet we're offering it at a taxpayer funded, and we're offering a free Zumba class, and that has been advertised a number of times on our websites as well. So were these programs considered as also as including the weight room?
Through you, Madam Chair, we looked at fitness studios, which essentially are at the Leisure Centre, at the Velodrome, at the Sports Centre, soon to be Sherwood Community Centre, where we offer a variety of programs, Pilates, yoga, albeit not hot yoga, and sort of the, senior stepped and sculpt and things like that, as well as the fitness centers, of which we only have 2. One is at the cycling center, and the other one is at the leisure center. So in reference to free programs, from time to time, we do offer incentive programs for people to come out and try things and whatnot, but that is certainly not the norm. Those programs are registered, and we do charge for those.
I just wanted to make sure that these programs were also included. It just seems that most of it was talked about the weight room facilities and the capital costs of replacing the weights, but there are other programs within, and again, programs that are available in the private sector and surrounding areas that are offered at these facilities. I understand completely the cycling center, because that's the legacy agreement is involved in that. So, and a quick question about the concessions over at the Memorial Arena. We are all hopefully really aware that the Milton Menace is now part of our community, and they've already started their exhibition hockey games, and I believe they'll be playing at the Memorial Arena. Is there any assistance going to be helping them with, because they are selling tickets, and I know that there is some interest, but it would be really difficult to have people to go to a hockey game with maybe one coin-operated Coke machine versus actual concessions that you would get at a hockey arena. Is there plans in place to assist our new hockey team?
Through you, Madam Chair, Council will recall some budgetary decisions that were made by staff. The standalone arenas essentially were loss leaders. And so as part of the budget process for 2019, we did eliminate the concessions areas per se, the French fries, popcorn, all that great stuff. But we also did not have a hockey team. And I'm going to turn to Joy to answer the question as to whether or not we have had conversations with the hockey team on what kind of potential there is, but certainly the town will not be providing the concessions at that arena. Whether concessions will be provided, I guess, will remain to be seen. We are still foot up to offer concessions, so certainly we can entertain some discussions. I'm just going to look for a head nod or head shake. Oh, I got nothing. That's it. I'll turn it over to Joy to answer that specific question.
Through you, Madam Chair, thanks. We have been in discussions with the Menace, and there will be concessions provided. They're going to be doing that themselves.
So message to the public, make sure you go out and buy tickets. I'm going to go to comments. I understand everybody's comments there. I understand the mayor's concern, but when I read through this report and the actual report, I have pretty strong confidence level that staff is going to come back with options. They'll come back with this report and not just say, okay, let's implement ABC. Like, they're not going to come back with 18. They're going to come back after some careful thought on this. There's some that I agree with, there's some that I disagree with, just like everybody else. And the decision will be made around this table. So, but I'm confident that staff is going to actually bring back that report with those options available to us. And one of the comments I think the mayor made mention, he says that we're looking at this report from a financial standpoint, and I also think that it's just as important to be looking at it from the bigger picture, so to speak, and not just with the dollars and cents are important, but we're building a community now that's going to be here 10, 15, 20 years, so the decisions that we're making around this table, especially around this report, I think are important. And while finances are important, I think the bigger picture is also to be looked at as well. Councillor Malbeuf mentioned that he didn't like consultants, which is breaking news if our media wants to pick that one up. But I think in this instance, it was important for us to have an unemotional review of our services. If we sat down with our, we're so used to doing things a certain way, and I think that we kind of would have just gone back into the way we've done things before. Having an outside consultant, I think, takes that emotion away. The emotion of closing Rotary Park, I spit my coffee out when I read it first as one of the options, as well as closing the senior center, two things that we know that probably won't be happening. But we had to have those things on there to get that clear picture. So I appreciate the consultant's report. And just sort of in a general esoteric way, we're living in a period of change, not just for this municipality, but for the region and the province. And I think we're going to have to accept that change. So there's a lot of things that we might not like about it. But again, looking at the bigger picture and not just finances, we have to look at every option that's available. And I think this is a good first step. It's not the end, but I think this is, as we move forward with this report, this is I think we could look back on this as this will be a watershed moment for this council in making the right decisions in growing our town. Thanks very much, and I'll be supporting the report.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cluett. I have Councillor Challoner up next.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I also am in support of the recommendation, but I have sent a note to the clerk with what I hope is an amendment that will make His Worship and Councillor Malbeuf happy, because I think it's important that it be endorsed. And the first paragraph would, and I'm the seconder of the motion, so I'm drawing on Z here, that the 18 priority opportunities identified by Blackline Consulting in the Service Delivery Review Phase 1 be endorsed in principle and decided upon by Council following financial and operational analysis, period. Okay? That makes it clear, and I think it's friendly. The thing that worries me, and Mike touched on it, I'd hate to see Council in a situation where something catastrophic happens with the pool, or something catastrophic happens with the senior center, and we're caught flat-footed because we didn't do our due diligence. I think it's important, regardless of how you feel about those facilities, that we have the facts about those facilities. And institutional knowledge comes into play here a little bit. That pool has been there since 1963. It was built by a private organization for the town. Colin and I were sort of laughing. If that was proposed today, it wouldn't be permitted to be built. It's in a floodplain. You wouldn't even be able to build a park there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the senior center. The rest of the senior center, or the building around the senior center, was torn down. That building is one of the older institutional buildings in the community. Well built for its time, but it's now 2019. It's inefficient from an energy standpoint. I'm assuming it's safe, but I want to see, from my perspective, so that I can sleep at night, at least an annual review on those on the buildings and our park sites and that pool, because I don't want to have the liability of that pool caving in when people are using it, and I certainly don't want to have the liability for the senior center should something catastrophic happen to that building. So I think it's wise for us to know, regardless of how we may feel about those buildings, there will be a time when, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to close them, because that will be the safe thing to do. And it's smart in the interim to understand how safe or unsafe they are today. That's our responsibility.
Thank you, Councillor Chandler. I have Councillor Hamid next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep it quick. I wasn't going to say much about the fitness program, since everything will come back to us anyway, but since there's been enough discussion, I think I should give my thoughts as well. I see fitness programs same as if we were running gas station. I mean, imagine a scenario where 30 years ago, Milton didn't have gas station, and the council at the time decided that we should operate a gas station or two. Today, we would be getting out of that business, even if we made a profit running a gas station or a grocery store or whatever. And I see fitness program in the same category. Governments should not be competing with private sectors. Government should not be in business where a private business model exists. We have plenty of gyms and plenty of weight rooms and plenty of Zumba classes and yoga classes and everything else. We don't need to be that program. The conversation of whether it makes a profit or not is completely irrelevant, in my opinion. Whether we've taken all the cost accountings or not doesn't really matter. I see in the same vein as I see us running a gas station or a grocery store or anything else. One other thought I had on the snow clearing. It talked about parked cars, and one of the recommendation was increase enforcement. Increased parking enforcement without better snow clearing will likely be seen as a money grab and will likely reduce resident satisfaction, not the other way around. One of the challenges, and like in a new area, especially on streets where we have a lot of townhouses, it's just anecdotal evidence. I mean, I've done no research on it, but in anecdotal comments I've received from residents is if they had a better idea, it would be easier for them to comply. The problem is that we say your snow will be cleared anytime in the next 24 hours or so. It's really difficult to then keep cars off the street for 24 hours. If they knew that, for the next 4 hours we can't park anywhere and they had the guests managed better, that would be easier to manage. So instead of, maybe in addition to additional parking enforcement, I would see if we can provide an alternative or use technology to give people a better indication of when a plow would be there. I spent the last 4.5 years building fulfillment last mile technologies at Amazon, focusing on when people can find out when the delivery will arrive. It would be awesome if, using my Milton app, I could know when a plow was expected. I didn't need to know exact time, but next 3 hours, that's good enough. But if we tell residents don't park the car on the street for the next 24 hours because we might show up at any point in the next 24 hours, then we shouldn't be surprised that they're not complying. So if we go down the route of additional parking enforcement, we better give them something alternative in return as well. I would also love to get more information on smart garbage bin. Thank you, Councillor Challoner. City of Halifax is something to look into. I'll do some research on my own as well, but I'd love to get some detail from staff. I'd also like to learn more about winter maintenance cost. I understand the differences and challenges in comparing the cost, but considering we're so far high, I would love to see some explanation of that. Beyond that, I'd really like the report, even though I disagree with some of the recommendations. I like the fact that it was there so we can discuss it, and the options are there, and I believe Paul Cripps hadn't answered the question through you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Cripps?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In regards to the winter control on the local streets, it's not a simple answer. We've had a staff team working on this issue since last spring, and we've come up with basically a three-prong approach that we're going to implement. Education, using technology. We're going to be bringing forward, or there's going to be a new service available online called Plow Tracks that will be launched in the not too distant future, and there'll be a communication strategy associated with that. And that'll give people an indication of where the plows have been, which in turn would help them understand where the plows are going to be. We're not quite at that level yet, but we've got take small steps. So that's part of the education. The other is to make sure that citizens know the levels of service of what to expect. We do advertise that every year, but are working with our communications people, we're going to do a better job in that area. Enforcement is definitely a part of the program. Bylaw staff are actually here tonight, and they're very interested in the comments about that because it's going to take additional resources if we're going to do additional enforcement in that area. I think it's key. I think we're going to have to get out there and demonstrate to people that we're serious about getting these cars off the road so that the plows can get through quickly and efficiently and meet our levels of service. And then, of course, the third prong is resources. If we're going to meet that mandate of 30% reduction in times getting on the local streets, in combination with education and enforcement, there will be a need for additional plowing vehicles and drivers, which would probably be done with contracted services. So, like I said, it's a three-prong approach. It's not an easy solution, but it's something we're going to have to work towards.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any more comments from council? Yes, Your Worship.
Madam Chair, Councillor Malboof had mentioned earlier on, I just want to pursue it, and this evolves around the consultants. Seems to me, and I stand corrected on this, I think we signed a contract for 3 years, I believe, there. So I just want to be very clear that this is only the start of the process and it's ongoing. So maybe if staff could just address that that's the case and what we can expect next. So.
All right. Through the chair. So we have not signed a 3-year contract. What we did was we established a roster for a 3-year period. So any subsequent phases that we do are still subject to engaging one of those roster consultants and getting council approval for the award of the work.
I think that's important to know, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thanks for clarifying that. Councillor Malboof.
Just a clarification on what Councillor Challoner was suggesting. Is that an amendment coming to this? Are you moving an amendment to the first paragraph?
Thank you. Any more comments? I just have one final comment to add. A lot of the topics have been touched upon already. Questions have been asked that I was planning to ask, but I just want to say I'm really happy this is happening. And I was really shocked as a new councillor to learn this has never happened before in recent history. So I'm happy to be here on the table when this is happening, to have my input, to have my voice here, and I'm looking forward to the consultants coming back with more options and recommendations. We are agreeing to it in principle, and I will be supporting it in principle. I might not agree with all the options, as many of my colleagues here said, but it is a good time to be a councillor in the town of Milton, which is growing so fast, and that we have the review in front of us that we can make important decisions that are really important to our residents. So I'm really happy to be able to do this. Now, I see we have an amendment to the original motion here, and I'm going to try my best to read it out correctly. Moved by Mayor Gord Krantz, seconded by Councillor Challoner, that item 1 of the recommendation be struck out and replaced with the following wording: that the 18 priority opportunities identified by Blackline Consulting in the Service Delivery Review Phase 1 be endorsed in principle and decided upon by Council following financial and operational analysis. Does everybody agree to that? Yes? Okay, all in favor? Motion carried. And now we will call a vote on the amended motion. All in favor? And that's carried. We will now move on to bylaws. It is moved by Councillor Best, seconded by Councillor Hamid. Be it resolved that bylaw number 084/2019 be read, passed, and numbered, and that the mayor and the town clerk be authorized to sign the said bylaw, seal it with the seal of the corporation, and that it be engrossed in the bylaw book. All in favor? Carries. We have now the introduction of notice of motion, and it is brought forward by Councillor Di Lorenzo. Subject is reducing litter and waste in our communities. This motion is to be considered at the September 16, 2019 council meeting. Okay. Okay, well, now we need a regional council update, and I would request everybody individually to give me their reports and updates. Councillor Melbuff? Councillor Best?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you for chairing this difficult part of the council meeting. Thank Mayor Krantz for his comments earlier. We did meet with 4 ministers, and I highlighted to some of the advocacy documents in the region. And also for the councillors there, you're quite aware that Minister Clark announced that we will have an answer to the regional review sometime in November, so stay tuned on that issue. But it is, that's referring to as the other review that's going on here, so we'll wait and see. Also, for all local councillors and regional councillors, as well as the media, we have a farm tour on Thursday, September 19th. I'd invite everybody to come. It's put on by the Halton Agricultural Advisory Committee, and this is a special tour. It's our 40th anniversary. We're inviting past members, including Councillor Lee, to come back and help tour. So if you please register at the halton.ca, really appreciate it, and that's my report.
Thank you. That's an excellent report. Councillor Hamid?
What he said.
Councillor Kloot?
What Z said.
Your worship. So we are done with that, and okay, and the next item is moved by Councillor Best, seconded by Councillor Challoner. Be it resolved that council convene into confidential session to discuss personal matters about an identifiable individual, including municipal or local board employees, and for labor relations or employee negotiations with respect to CAO recruitment. And the remainder of this evening's council meeting will take place within the Fallingbrook room. Thank you, everybody.
Madam Chair, do we not need a motion to go to the confidential session?
Okay, all in favor?